You all know alarms, right? They've been part of GameMaker since almost the very beginning. If you want to have something happen after an interval of time, you can set an alarm for that interval and then put the code that you want to run in the alarm event. They're rather rudimentary, and if you've used GameMaker for any length of time, you probably run into their limitations at some point or another, but they'll get the job done in a pinch. Fast forward to May of 2022, and in one of the recent betas, GameMaker has added this new feature called time sources. There are two things you need to know about time sources. One is that they are timing mechanisms that aren't necessarily tied to an object, and if I had to predict what everyone on the internet was going to be saying about time sources in a few weeks' time, I would expect to hear a lot of people saying that time sources are alarms but better. So this is a very simple bullet hell game loop. I have a player spaceship. I can shoot things out of my nose. There's an enemy spaceship over here. It is shooting things out of its, I guess it's not a nose. It's shooting things in a spiral, and the code that is running this looks pretty much what you'd expect it to look like. So there's each the player and the foe have a can shoot variable in the step event. The enemy checks to see if it can shoot, and then if it can, it sets can shoot to false, creates a bullet, and sets alarm index 0 to 60. In the alarm index 0 event, let me increase this font size. We're just going to reset the can shoot value. And it's the same thing in the player, except instead of shooting automatically, we are shooting when the player clicks the left mouse button. Right? That's about as basic bullet hell gameplay as you can get. So I'm going to start with the OBJ foe here, and then I'll move back onto the player later. If I were to get rid of the alarm event, so if I were to get rid of the alarm index 0 equals 60 for a 1 second cooldown, and then if I were to delete the alarm event, this would obviously make the foe shoot once and then never again, right? So enter time systems. Time systems were added, by the way, in GameMaker beta version 2022.500.0. I want to say last week was like 0.48. I don't recommend using them if you're on a version earlier than the one that I'm on right now, which is 2022.500.052, because when they first came out, they were slightly broken. As usual, if you're watching this video far in the future, after the May 2022 GameMaker update has come out, you will be on 2022.5. It's going to be the first stable version that this is featured in. Anything older than that, and you will not have access to this new time sources feature. So if I were to type time source and control space, that is going to bring up a number of built-in constants related to time sources in GameMaker, a number of functions related to time sources in GameMaker. I'll go through what the important ones do. We'll start with time source create. And time source create is going to create us a new time source, and this is going to this is a function that is going to take a few arguments. One is the parent. There are some other things that this can be later, but by default, we are going to want time source create to take as a parent either time source game or time source global. And what the difference between those two is, I'll get to later on. For now, I'm going to go with game. The period, this is the interval. This is the interval on which you want the timer to be set for. So if we want our enemy here to have a 1 second cooldown, we can set this to 1 and set the next argument, the units, to time source unit seconds. Or if you want your time sources to run on a frame-based interval, we could set this period to 60, and we could set the units to time source units frames. I personally am a big fan of having every metric in my game being measured in units per second instead of units per frame. Not only because some people have opinions about frame rate independence in games, but also because I find it easier to visualize saying something is moving in like pixels per second instead of pixels per step. But that is neither here nor there. And lastly, there's a couple optional arguments you can pass to this time source create function, but we can also define a callback. And a callback, for those who are unaware, this is the fancy name for a function which you don't execute directly, but you assign as a variable, you assign as a function argument, and you can execute later. In this case, when the timer goes off, you would execute the function. You can define function callbacks in any number of ways that you can define functions in GameMaker. You could give it a name. You could say something like function execute when the when the timer goes off, and you can make this function, and you could say if I'm gonna get a little ahead of myself, self.can shoot equals true, and then we could assign this function without the parentheses to the time source create function, and that is a function that is going to be executed when the timer goes off. Or you can do this in another way, and you can assign a function to a variable like this, maybe a local variable perhaps, and you can pass this function again without the parentheses to the time source create function, and it will be executed when the timer goes off. Or, and this is what I usually do because it's a little bit more, kind of has all your code just in one place. You can define your callback function just inside the time source create function like this. You are allowed to do this. I do this quite often. And now, when this timer that we're creating, when this time source that we're creating goes off, it is going to execute this function, and it is going to set the can-shoot variable of this enemy on the screen. It's going to set it back to true. Now, there's a couple other optional arguments that you can include in the time source create function. One is going to be potential callback arguments. So by default, this function that you assign as a callback does not accept any arguments, or at least it will not have any arguments given to it. You can create the function signature to include arguments, but GameMaker won't fill them in with anything when the callback is invoked. If you want that, you can pass an array, and the array will contain some values that will be passed to the callback function as arguments. You could have that be any old thing that you might want. I'll try to demonstrate this later. For now, I'm just going to leave that as an empty array because I don't need any. Next, there is the number of repetitions. So if you want this time source to only happen once, if you want the timer to go off once and then never again, you could set the repetition arguments to 1. If you want the time source to, for example, go off and then reset itself and then go off again, and then that's it, you could set it to 2. If you want the time source to go off a total of 10 times, you could set it to 10. If you want your time source to run infinitely, if you want your time source to not stop getting reset and rerunning ever, you can set it to -1, and this will allow the time source to just run on loop for as long as the game is around until it's told to stop by either the game closing or you calling a function on it that tells it to stop. And there's one more, there's the expiry type. So the expiration type is probably the least important argument that you could pass to the time source create function. There is a small difference between time source expire after and time source expire nearest, in that time source expire after will cause the timer to trigger the callback only after it has ticked down to 0 and not before, whereas time source expire nearest will still allow the time source to expire and call the function callback when it's even if it reaches a very small value that isn't quite 0. So if your timer ticks down to something like 0.001, GameMaker will say, okay, that value is close enough to 0, we can just have it expire now. This would be the case if in the next frame, if your time source were to tick down by another frame when GameMaker checks it, if it would be farther away from 0, like in the negative direction than it is right now. Again, not very important. I'm just going to set this to after. It is an optional argument, so if you don't want to deal with it, you could just not include it at all. Alright, so this on its own isn't going to do anything. If I were to run the game now, we would still be shooting once and then never again. Alright, it's pretty boring. Time sources will not start automatically, so we're going to need to say var, let's call it timer, is going to be equal to time source create. And then after that, we're going to need to say time source start, and we'll start the timer. And this is going to cause the timer to be reset after every second. This is going to cause our can shoot variable to be reset after every second. Although this isn't really the best use of this time source mechanism, because you do still need to say time source destroy when you're finished with it. And if you would just create a time source, start it, and then ignore it for the rest of the game. Unfortunately, unlike structs and arrays and some of the things that GameMaker has been moving in the direction of lately, the timer will persist, and it'll still exist in the game. And if you leave it going for long enough, this will technically constitute a memory leak. If you were to show debug message the value of a time source, you would see that instead of being a struct or anything, like a lot of things that have been added to GameMaker recently are, we're just going to be seeing an index, much like you would have seen in for things like data structures in old versions of GameMaker. But And it seems to be actually going a little bit haywire. Oh, that's because it's running in perpetuity. So, but we're both leaving the existing time sources running, and we're also creating new ones as time goes on. Anyway, these are indices. These aren't like structs or anything like that. I understand the implementation details of why GameMaker does that, of why Yo-Yo Games implemented them like that, but it is maybe a little bit of a surprise to see something doing that, to see something behaving like that at this point in GameMaker history after so many things have been moved over to structs and arrays. So if I were to instead move this over to something like the enemy create event, we can actually do pretty much the same thing, but in a maybe a little bit of a saner way. We can create the time source in the create event. We can tell it automatically to set can shoot equal to true after every once a second. In the create event, we're just telling this to fire and forget. So now if I were to run the game, we would have the enemy is going to be spraying out a spiral of bullets, 1 per second around itself. And it's just going to be running off of the timer that we created in the create event like this, and we don't have to worry about anything like that in the step event over here. Alright, that's pretty reasonable. So we can actually take this a step further, and we can actually move pretty much the entire shooting mechanism in this enemy step event over to the time source. So because all we're doing here is resetting the can shoot value to true, and then like when can shoot is true in the step event, we're just creating a bullet. We could very easily just move this all over to the callback function of the time source, and we can just like not deal with the can shoot value entirely. And this is going to accomplish pretty much the same thing with the small detail that when the game first starts, on the first frame of the game, the enemy is not going to shoot the bullet. It's going to wait until the timer goes off for the first time instead of being ready to go by default. And we can see that this shows us a few things. One is that we can actually really clean up and consolidate a lot of this shooting code here for this kind of game, for this kind of enemy, by putting it just in a single time source in the create event. And two, it shows us that the callback function is actually bound to the instance that is like in scope when the time source is created. Hey. So since this is the create event of an obj_foo, the callback function is bound as a method to the instance of obj_foo that created the time source. If you were to do this in something like the constructor of a struct, the callback function would instead be bound to the instance of the struct that was created. If you were to do this in the global scope, the function would just kind of exist in the global scope of a game if you weren't doing it inside an instance of anything. But it also raises the question of what happens if you were to destroy the instance that owns this time source without destroying the time source. And there's a few things that you might reasonably expect to happen here. You might expect the time source to be just like deleted on its own. That is not an unreasonable thing to expect to happen if time sources were garbage collected, which I've already said that they're not, unfortunately. You might expect the game to crash because it is suddenly trying to access variables of the instance that has been destroyed. That is not an unreasonable expectation. What actually happens is arguably more cursed than the first two things that I suggested. What will actually happen is that the instance's data in the game will continue to exist. The instance itself will be destroyed and it won't take part in the step event and the draw event and all that, but its data structure in the computer's memory will continue to exist because it is still like referenced by the time source even after it has been destroyed. And that is something that I have maybe some mixed feelings about. But we're going to see that when I hit the spacebar and destroy the instance, the time source keeps running, and more importantly, it keeps firing bullets from the location of where the enemy used to be, because as far as the time source is concerned, the enemy is actually still there, it's just not actively running in the game. And what this means is that I would have to go to the destroy event, or maybe the cleanup event, because I posted that video earlier today, and I guess I'm obligated to mention it from here on out. We are going to need to say time source destroy when the instance is destroyed. And maybe, alright, fine. I will change this to the cleanup event, just because you would want this to happen when the player leaves the room or something, not just when the instance is destroyed. Right. And now we're gonna have our foe shooting around in a circle, but we're also gonna have, when I hit the spacebar, it's actually gonna stop because the time source has been deleted in the cleanup event over here. All right, that's the basics of time sources. There are a number of other things you can do with these. How am I doing on time? I'm about 20 minutes into the recording. I have no doubt that's going to be a lot shorter after I edit it. Let's see. Time source control space will bring up this whole list. A number of these are somewhat self-evident in what they do, judging by the name. Time source exists will tell you whether or not a time source exists with a given index or not. Time source get state will tell you whether or not it's currently running. Time source get time remaining. I don't think I need to explain what some of these do. Time source reconfigure could be good if you want to change the settings on an existing timer without having to like destroy it and create a new one. Let's see. I think next I will go into the step event and I will say if keyboard check VK like tab. Let's make this keyboard check pressed. We can say time source pause, because we have pause, start, and stop. And we can pause the timer like this. If I were to do VK underscore, what's another key on the keyboard? I like the tab key. I also kind of like the enter key. Like this. We can say time source start, and this will resume the time source. So we have start, stop, and pause. Pause, this is pretty much the same things that you'd find on like a DVD player or something like that. Pause will stop the time source but preserve its state. Stop will stop the time source and like reset it to the beginning. And start will start the time source from wherever it happens to be. So with this I can hit the tab key and I'll let it run for a minute. I'll hit the tab key and the time source is paused. If I were to hit the enter key, the time source would resume. And we would resume shooting again. Because of the way that I implemented like the spiral pattern based on like current time, the spiral was not interrupted and kind of continued a few degrees past where it left off, but that's not related to time sources. Unfortunately, at least as of my recording this, and I would really like it if Yo-Yo Games added something like this before adding it into the stable version of GameMaker, but there is no way to currently slow down or speed up a time source. So if you have a time source that's ticking down at a rate of like it's going to go off every second or something, there is no way to have that time source slow down. So if you have like a slow down or speed up feature or something like that in your game, there is no way to tell the time source to slow down to a rate of like half speed or something like that without going to the trouble of saying time source reconfigure and then manually resetting all the values that it contains, which would be undoubtedly a little bit annoying. And I would appreciate it if GameMaker would give us something like time source set like time scale or something like that, but whether or not that happens remains to be seen. So next, I said I would talk about the difference between time source global and time source game. So the difference between them isn't very great, but they will behave differently under different circumstances. So if I were to go back to the step event and instead of saying time source pause my own timer, a specific instance of a timer, if I were to instead pause time source game and maybe resume all time sources attached to time source game, then this will, instead of pausing a single instance of a timer, this will pause any timers in the game that have been parented to time source game. And when I run the game now, it's going to do the same thing. I only happen to have one timer that is parented to time source game. I only happen to have one timer in this entire demo, at least at the moment. And if I were to hit tab, we would pause it. And if I were to hit enter, we would resume it, right? But if you were to instead say time source pause, time source global, and when we create our time source, if we were to parent that to time source global instead of time source game, GameMaker actually won't let us. So if I were to let this run, all right, it's running as we would expect. And if I were to hit the tab key, we're going to see that GameMaker is actually not letting us pause that. And Also, when I hit enter, I'm not allowed to try to start it. And that is because time source global is intended to be stateless. It is intended to be running like attached to things that are independent of the game. So if you have something like an autosave mechanism that runs in the background periodically every couple seconds, you would probably want to attach that to time source global so that it just happens on its own. You also, I believe, don't need to explicitly start a time source that is attached to time source global. Nope, you do. Okay. Don't know why I thought that. Anyway, if you were to try to start or stop an individual timer, you are still allowed to do that. You're still allowed to say time source pause self.timer if this timer has been attached to the global time source. You just can't do it for every global time source. So I can pause this timing mechanism. I can resume it. Right, it's gonna keep going. Pause. Resume. I just can't start and stop the entire time source global at once, as I could if I were using instead time source game. Did I show that when I started this section of the video? I don't remember. Anyway, we are allowed to start and stop time source game as a whole whenever we feel like it. So it's paused now. It's resuming. Great. So there is one last thing about parent time sources that we can do, which is that time sources can't only be parented to time source game or global. Time sources can actually be parented to each other. So if I were to create another timer, and let's call this like self dot another timer is going to be time source create, and instead of parenting it to time source game or global or whatever, we could parent it to self dot timer. We could parent it to the original timer. Let's make the period like 0.25. So we're gonna do something every quarter of a second. No, GameMaker, why are you? I still don't know what hotkey makes GameMaker try to do that. It's really annoying. Time source seconds. Like I've looked in the keybinds preferences, and I still don't know which one does that. Like tries to open up the project, the IDE homepage. But that's a mystery that's going to have to wait for another day. The callback is going to be function, which is going to do something. Callback arguments can be... Actually, I'll just... I won't include any of the optional arguments. I will, however, create a bullet here. So we're going to sort of shoot secondary bullets like this. And instead of doing it in a spiral, let's just say x speed can be set to 0, y speed can be like -4. X speed and y speed, by the way, are my own variables, which are updating the bullet's position. They're not using the built-in GameMaker like h speed and v speed, because I don't like h speed and v speed. I like being able to control these things myself. Anyway, time source start. Let's start the other timer, and this is going to cause the time source to shoot a bullet straight up in the air, but it's also going to do the spiral at the same time. And let's see, we are... Oh, it only did it once. Okay, so slipping my mind a little bit. The default is that a time source only executes once. If you want it to run on repeat, you do need to specify -1. Like that. Okay. Yep. Much better. Anyway, from here, if we were to time source pause time source underscore game, obviously that would pause all the time sources in the game that are either that descend directly or indirectly from that time source. However, if I were to also say time source pause my own, like my primary timer, this would pause not only the primary timer, the main one that's shooting in a spiral up here, but it would also pause the timer that descends from it, this one down here, the secondary one. So if I were to run the game now, we're gonna be shooting some bullets ahead of us and also in a spiral. But if I were to hit tab, both time sources would be paused. All right, and then when I were to hit enter, both time sources would be resumed. Now, if I were to delete the spaceship, we're actually going to keep going. If you look down on the console, you can see a message that says cannot destroy the time source index 2 unless its children have been destroyed as well. And I honestly, I kind of disagree with that. I feel like if you delete a time source that has time sources parented, parented to it, descending from it rather, that it should automatically destroy all of the descendant time sources. But unfortunately, that is not what happens, so we're going to need to either do that ourselves by using the time source destroy another timer. Command like that down there, and now it's correctly deleted. Or we could sort of do it, for lack of better words, recursively. We could use the function that is time source get children, and this would return us an array of all the time sources that are parented onto another time source. And you could use this to loop over that array and delete any children time sources, and not have to worry about deleting time sources that still have things that are attached to it. And honestly, again, I kind of disagree with that design. I feel like if you delete a time source, it should automatically delete any of its descendant time sources. If you delete a time source that has things that you are using that are attached to it, that's kind of a problem you should deal with, like, on your own. But nevertheless, that's the rules. I don't make the rules. What next? Are there any others that I have not talked about yet? So time source. Some of the constants like state active, state initial, state pause, state stopped. That should be pretty self-explanatory. That goes with time source get state and time source pause and those playback related functions. As I mentioned, get parent, get period, get reps completed, get reps remaining. Those should be all self-evident what they do. I guess the last thing that I'll do here is go back over to the player object and implement a time source here in place of the alarm. This is going to be a little bit more complicated because the player doesn't just shoot on a regular interval. The player actually has to shoot when, like, the player clicks the button, and that means that we can't just have this timer set in the create event and then forget about it and let it do its thing until the instance is destroyed. Instead, I'm going to say self.timer is going to be time source create. The parent is time source game. The period is going to be 1 second as established. Actually, I think this was set to 10 seconds, so that's 1/6 of a second. Time source units seconds like this. And the callback is going to be setting the time source can shoot to true, setting the can shoot value to true. And I am not going to say time source start here. I'm going to do that in the step event when we actually shoot something. So first I will say time source reset, and that will reset the state of the time source, and then time source start. And this should cause the time source's state to be reset, and it should cause it to start counting down again. And I can get rid of the alarm 0 event for this because we are moving away from alarms. Alright, so if I were to hold down the left mouse button, we can see that we are shooting a bullet about once every 1/6 of a second, every 10 frames or so. Okay, that's great. If you were to not call time source reset, I don't believe the time source would actually, like, run. Oh, it would. Okay. So time source start, if it's already counted down. That's like two little minute details that I've been wrong about in this video. I remember specifically testing that before I sat down to record this, and because I knew I was going to want to talk about it, and then I forgot what the answer was. But we can, that does make our job a little bit simpler. We can simply call time source start when we click the left mouse button to reset this time source. If the time source was already running and you wanted to reset it to the beginning, obviously you would want to say time source reset, but we don't need to do that here. So, I think that is going to do it for today. I have talked for longer than I expected to about these things. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the video description. I encourage you to play around with these if you are one who likes to mess around with new GameMaker features while they're still in beta. I'm definitely curious if anyone's got any uses for these that I haven't thought of yet, because this feels like something that people are going to come up with a lot of creative uses for. So if you've got any of those, feel free to share them in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you found that useful. I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, 1 tutorial like this, once in a while 2 if they're a little on the short side, and 1 Let's Make a Game, which currently happens to also be a bullet hell. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to subscribe. If you want to see more of this in action, I will be probably soon rewriting a little bit of old alarm code or a little bit of old timing code in the bullet hell game to work with time sources. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there will be links to that in all the usual places. You can see some fun things like your name in the credits, or about once a month I post a preview of my future plans. And if you wanted to pledge, I would definitely appreciate it. Aside from that, I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Then Nothing Happened, Squarecrow, Sindra Larson, Posho, Gunnar Clovis, GameMaker, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, and Army Armbruster for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or hear yourself shouted out at the end like this, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.